The general stood in the tunnel, staring out across the battlefield. He spat on the ground and tasted blood, coughing as he turned back to his men. Rocks. They had been routed by rocks. He was stupid. He should have taken precautions, but he hadn't. And when those stone spears had fallen from the sky, his colts had been massacred. He looked up at the tunnel, horn and torches providing light as ponies licked their wounds. They were too well trained to groan and moan in pain, but the general could feel it in the air. If he could still feel fear, he knew he would have pissed himself by now. When the first stalactite had touched ground, he had been caught completely flat-hoofed. The second had buried two ponies next to him, and the third had hit the back lines seconds later. With not enough light to see them coming, the soldiers were being killed before they knew what was happening. The general rested his head against the wall, willing the pounding in his head to go away. He had ordered a shield put up, but the combined might of his entire force could barely stop one stone spire falling at that speed. They never had a chance. He had never ordered the retreat, but his colts weren't stupid. They would tell themselves that it was a tactical retreat, but the general knew the route for what it was. He was humiliated and ashamed, but most of all, he was angry. Angry. Just thinking the word made his head pound again. He had lost nearly half the ponies that had gone into that room with him. A quarter of his entire forces would never fight again. He had known many of them personally from his days as warrant officer, and what was once merely an order had changed. He focused his gaze across the rock-strewn killing ground, the wall of garbage silhouetted by the rebels' torches. He had cared nothing for them before, but now it was personal. Now his anger burned inside him until his breath became faster, the air around him tingling and making his fur stand on end. His skin rippled as the familiar heat snaked across it, and he finally found the word for it. He hated those rebels. He hated their tricks, and he hated this place, and his hatred was going to make them pay. Something tapped his shoulder, and the general whipped around with his horn flaring. His sergeant recoiled, his eyes widening at the hostile display, and the general realized what he had done. Taking a deep breath and letting his magic die down, he glared at his officer. "Well, sir, we have 73 able-bodied units left. They're awaiting your orders." The general frowned, turning his gaze back towards the old base. "Sergeant, ready another 40. Give those who survived our last push a chance to recover. I want new blood out there this time." The subordinate saluted and vanished. The general lifted his head and stood, feeling the heat burning through his limbs. "I'm going to dig our dead out of that rubble, and then I'm going to bury a rock in the head of whoever gave that order. I'm going to kill every single pony responsible for this, starting with the ones behind that wall." Big Macintosh wasn't stupid. When the Pegasi had forced the soldiers to retreat, his ponies had wanted to celebrate. He would have none of it, though, and had ordered them to do a damage assessment of the wall and resupply their ammunition. Big Mac knew neither their defenses nor their supplies had taken a serious hit, but it kept them busy. When the soldiers pushed again, he didn't want a single one of his volunteers to be caught flat-hoofed. He sighed, taking his gaze back towards the town. Somewhere back there, the ponies who were too young or old to fight were hiding, waiting for a signal that they should evacuate. Big Mac had told Rarity that an evacuation should be immediate, but he had to concede at that point that they'd have nowhere to go. Their best bet was to try and wait it out. And that left the lives of the town to a handful of ponies and one heap of stone and wood. Big Mac surveyed the scrambling figures around him, taking a head count with disquieting ease as he walked along the base of the wall. New Ponyville had been founded by the survivors of Ponyville. with meager supplies and even less morale. In the time since, their population had sank even further. Even now, nearly half of those alive were sick in the hospital, barely able to move. Even with volunteering requirements being stretched, he had been left with a fighting force of barely 50 for a fight on which every pony's lives depended. He had started the day with 19 earth ponies, but 2 had died. Somewhere in the dark of that cave ceiling, less than a score of Pegasi awaited another signal. Without their magic, the unicorns were little more than body shields, and so Big Mac had ordered all but one to remain away from the fighting. Speaking of, he thought as he turned away from the wall, a white unicorn sat at the end of the bridge, her face red even through her coat. Big Mac let his hoofs herald his approach, not wanting to startle the mare. Even before he asked the question, Big Mac knew the answer. Still, he had to be sure. "Any luck, Pop?" With a sigh, Pop massaged her temples with a hoof, coughing slightly between breaths. "Sorry, Big Mac. I can't explain it. I know how the pieces should go together, but it's like I'm missing one." She coughed again and stood up, shaking the dirt off herself before casting a glance towards the wall. "I don't know how long it's going to be like this. There's no sense of end getting closer, and I'm no use back here. Let me on that wall. I know I can't buck as well as an earth pony." Big Mac shook his head and cut Pop off, already knowing where the conversation would go. "We've talked about this, Pop. I can't risk you getting hurt, no matter what. Once your magic is back, I promise you can get as high on that wall as you can climb. But not a moment sooner." Big Mac never knew if Pop was going to argue of the point further. As the final word left his mouth, another yell came across the bridge. As soon as Big Mac turned his head, he saw the light shining over the wall. The soldiers had returned. "Sergeant, spread the word. I want every soldier on the perimeter to focus on their sky shield. Let the rest of the second row handle the hailstorm. It's just going to be 3 of them, so I need the best on that." The general thought for a moment, as troops rushed out of the tunnel and around him, their horns casting beams of light skyward. "That will leave 15 of us for offensive strikes. More than enough to whittle them down." The sergeant nodded and rushed towards the forming ranks. But the general wasn't in such a hurry. They had a minute or so before they were in lethal range of those rocks, and the lights would give them a warning if any surprised leg tights. He intended to take advantage of the opportunity. He looked to his right and saw the dark and boarded building from earlier. It had likely been a guardhouse of some sort, but had clearly been abandoned. Not surprising, since it would have hardly made a good position to block them from the town proper. The general considered garrisoning in it, but quickly dismissed the notion. It provided excellent coverage of the battlefield, but was clearly out of range of the wall. Useless. He turned his gaze to the left. Nothing but darkness on that side, but the last scout he had sent had walked along the cavern wall all the way until the water stopped him. He had been very clear that scouts were posted along the other bank every few hundred feet, and the general did not like the idea of his colts being caught under fire while trying to cross the water. They couldn't shoot what they couldn't see, and all the rebels would have to do was stand back and throw the rocks towards the screams. The royal guards who did take cover would be trampled or drowned. No, their best bet was to simply take the bridge. All they had to do was get rid of that stupid wall. "General, forces are in position, sir. We advance on your order." The general nodded. His guts squirmed and his skin crawled. His lips stretched apart as he thought of the bloodshed to come and the rush of his last kill. Let Trixie plan and scheme her way through things, he thought as he walked forward to join his colts. I'll do things my way. Let's put this hatred to use. Red flinched as the first spell hit the wall with a crack, dust falling around him. He braced himself against the stone, leaning his bulk into it. He heard a scream from above and grimaced, resisting the urge to rush up and take the post. His bulk was best used here, but he knew his bucking leg would put most of these amateurs to shame. There was also another scream, and then a thunk from behind him as some pony hit the ground. Red's jaw tightened. Something hit the wall like a stick of dynamite, and the vibration sent pain through his teeth. He heard a wet gurgle over the noise of chaos, and something warm and wet splashed across his face. He shut his eyes and tried not to think of his neighbors dropping like flies. There was a crack of metal on stone, and this time from his side of the bridge. Red looked up in time to see one of Big Macintosh's boulders go flying overhead. With a moment of hesitation, he figured that he would take enough pressure off them for him to start replacing his fallen fellows on the wall. And he hated not knowing what was going on. There wasn't much scaffolding to speak of, but a clever pony could find hoof holds on the wall easily enough. He reached the top just as a loud whistle came from behind him, and he grabbed a melon-sized rock in both hooves as he peeked over the top. Not so far away, horns were lit up with an array of colors in careful 5x8 formation. The air in front of it, the first rock, sparkled and cracked in as many colors, and the defender's stones were deflected. But Red's attention was grabbed by something else entirely. Out of the darkness in the cave, like an assault from the skies, a dozen stalactites the size of ponies came down. 50 yards above the host, something crackled in the air. Red remembered how the unicorns had tried to hold the stalactites last time, but trying to stop them from falling only let them pile above their heads. This time, however, the stalactites didn't stop. In fact, it barely even slowed. Only, it wasn't headed towards the soldiers? Red's heart sank, realizing what was happening as the other stalagmites hit. The soldiers had erected a cone-shaped barricade above their heads. As the stalactites hit, they simply slid down the side. Red swore under his breath, and Big Mac told him that the stalactites wouldn't hold the invaders for long. But Red thought they'd have more time than this. More stalactites connected with the shield and slid down harmlessly to the side, illuminating streaks through the darkness air like shooting stars as a shield flared. Though it was taking a lot of effort on the attacker's part, the defender's Pegasi were now all but useless. Red reared up on his two back legs and hoisted his missile into the wall, turning around and bucking it in one motion. He lost sight of it in the darkness immediately, and knew it was ineffectual as his comrades' attempts. At the end of the day, rocks just weren't going to beat magic. In tandem, over a dozen horns flared in the distance. Red stared for a moment as he realized the flares weren't getting bigger, only closer. He scrambled down the wall and threw himself against it just as the dolge hit. He clenched his jaw and immediately regretted it, nearly screaming from the pain as the vibration shook him. The dirt and stone beneath his hooves felt like sand as his legs grew numb. A few seconds seemed to last several minutes. It was only when he sank to the ground that he realized the assault had passed, and he struggled to get back on his feet. He tried to listen to the yells around him, but all he could make out was a loud ringing, punctuated by muted screams. The world turned sideways, and he belatedly realized that his head had fallen into the dust. He coughed, and his head flared, and before his eyes, a purple mare tumbled from above and landed on her side, her back to him. She did not move. For the first time, Red wondered how much longer they could hold.